The morning Mamie Gentry rode into Caldwell, Kansas. The sky was the color of a bruise itself, purple and swollen along the horizon, pressed flat by a heat that had no mercy and offered none. And the way she held herself in the saddle, rigid and careful, like a woman who had learned that any sudden movement carried a cost, told Luke Dunlap everything he needed to know before she ever opened her mouth. He was leaning against the post outside Hector Vane's dry goods store, arms crossed, watching the main street of Caldwell the way a man watches weather when he knows something is coming and can't yet name what it is. It was the summer of 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a town perpetually caught between the wildness of the open range and the fragile attempt at civilization that the settlers kept trying to build around it. Cowboys came through by the hundreds that time of year, trail dusty and loud, spending their wages on whiskey and cards and trouble. Luke had been sheriff's deputy for 2 years and had seen enough of what men did when they felt untouchable to make him careful and watchful in a way that had nothing to do with cowardice. The woman came in from the East Road, which was already unusual. Most people coming to Caldwell came up from the south with the cattle drives or west from Wichita. The East Road came from Abilene, and before that from a stretch of smaller settlements that had grown up along the creeks and draws of the Kansas grasslands. She was riding a bay mare that looked well cared for despite the dust, and she had a single worn carpetbag tied behind the saddle. She wore a blue calico dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone thin, and her dark hair was pinned up under a sunbonnet, but the bonnet had slipped back enough that Luke could see her face clearly as she passed. She was somewhere around 25, he reckoned. Dark brown eyes that moved quickly, cataloging the street the way someone does when they have learned to always know where the exits are. A straight nose, a soft mouth set in a firm line, and on the left side of her jaw, yellowing at the edges but still unmistakably a bruise, the kind that comes from something deliberate and hard. She called it an accident later. He hadn't asked. She pulled the mare up outside the Caldwell house, which passed itself off as a hotel by virtue of having 4 rooms on the upper floor, and a woman named Edna Plum who ran the place with a combination of iron will and genuine Christian charity. Mamie Gentry dismounted with that careful, practiced stillness and tied the mare to the post with nimble hands. She stood for a moment with her back to the street, composing herself in some private way that Luke recognized as a woman gathering every reserve she had before she walked through a door. He pushed off from the post and crossed the street without quite deciding to. She turned when she heard his boots on the boards, and her eyes went to the badge on his chest first, then up to his face. There was a flicker of something there, not quite fear, but the wariness of someone who had learned that authority and safety didn't always travel together. Luke took his hat off. He was 31, lean and weathered from years working cattle before the deputy's job, with light brown hair that had gone sun-bleached at the temples and gray eyes that people sometimes described as kind and sometimes as unreadable, depending on what they needed from him at the time. "Ma'am," he said, "you looking to stay at the Caldwell house?" "I am," she said. Her voice was steady and he gave her credit for that. "Edna Plum runs it. She's a good woman. She'll treat you right." He paused, not sure what else to say and aware that he was stalling for reasons he couldn't have named clearly. "You ride in from Abilene." "From Harlow Creek," she said. "Before that, Abilene." Harlow Creek was a small settlement, maybe 30 miles east, built around a grist mill and a handful of farms. He nodded. "Long ride." "Yes," she said. Her eyes went briefly, involuntarily, to the far end of the street east, the direction she had come from. It was the kind of look you see on someone checking whether they've been followed. Luke said nothing about the bruise. He did not look at it pointedly. He did not ask how she got it or whether she was all right, because he had spent enough time around women who had learned to armor themselves with the word fine to know that pressing that particular place would only cause her to close off. Instead he said, "If you need anything while you're in Caldwell, my office is the second building down on the left. "Name's Luke Dunlap. Mamie Gentry," she said, and extended her hand with a kind of formality that he found both touching and impressive. He shook it. Her grip was firm. She went inside and he stood for a moment in the street, hat still in his hand, and then walked back to his post. But he couldn't settle back into his previous ease. Something about Mamie Gentry had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter, not painful yet, but present, and impossible to ignore. He learned pieces of her story over the following days the way you learn a landscape when you're new to it gradually, by moving carefully through it and paying attention to what the terrain reveals without forcing it. Edna Plum was his primary source, not because either of them was gossiping, but because Edna had a practical nature and understood that the deputy needed to know about the people who came through town, especially when those people arrived looking like Mamie Gentry had arrived. "She's got herself a position as a seamstress with Adeline Farrow," Edna told him on the second morning, passing him in front of her hotel with a basket of laundry. "Adeline's been wanting help since her girl married and moved to Dodge. Mamie came down here on the recommendation of someone in Abilene. She say anything about where she'd been before." Edna gave him the look of a woman who respected other people's privacy, but understood that there were limits to that respect when someone's well-being was in question. "She's been married," she said quietly. "I don't think she is any longer." Luke nodded and left it there. Adeline Farrow's seamstress shop occupied the front room of her house on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, Pine Street, they called it, though there wasn't a pine tree in 40 miles. It was a modest place, neat and respectable, with bolts of fabric stacked along one wall and a dress form standing in the window like a silent sentinel. Adeline herself was a widow of 60 who had come to Kansas with her late husband in the early days and had decided after he died that she liked the territory well enough to stay. She was brisk and perceptive, and she took to Mamie with a quickness that said she recognized what she was looking at and wanted to help. Luke found reasons to walk past Adeline Farrow's shop. He was not proud of this. He was a grown man with actual duties. There were always cattle disputes to mediate, drunken cowboys to manage, property lines to referee. But he found himself on the north end of Pine Street more often than those duties strictly required. Sometimes he saw Mamie through the window, bent over a garment at the wide table, her dark head down, her fingers quick and precise with needle and thread. Sometimes she looked up and saw him looking, and he would nod and keep walking, and she would watch him for a moment before bending back to her work. On the fourth day, he stopped. He told himself it was because he needed to speak with Adeline about a matter related to a cattle baron named Court Halsey, whose men had been causing trouble at the southern end of town, which was true, because Halsey's operation ran a few miles south of Caldwell, and his cowboys were the aggressive kind. But when he knocked on the door of the shop, it was Mamie who answered, because Adeline was at the back of the house, and for a moment they stood in the doorway looking at each other with the particular awkward awareness of two people who have been thinking about each other and are not yet ready to admit it. "Mr. Dunlap," she said, "is Adeline in?" "She's in the back. Come in." She stepped aside and he came into the shop, which smelled of cut fabric and the faint sweetness of the beeswax she used on her thread. There was a half-finished shirt on the table and beside it a woman's riding skirt in dark green wool. He looked at the skirt because looking at her directly felt like looking at something bright, not uncomfortable exactly, just requiring adjustment. "That's fine work," he said, meaning the skirt. She glanced at it. "It'll do," she said, which was the answer of someone who held themselves to a high standard and was honest about the distance between what they'd made and what they could make. "It's better than fine," he said. She looked at him then, and the wariness in her eyes was still there, but there was something else alongside it now, something tentative and questioning, as if she were trying to determine whether he was the kind of man who said things he meant or the kind who said pleasing things reflexively. He held her gaze steadily, and after a moment she gave a small nod, accepting the compliment. Adeline came through from the back then, and the moment dissolved into ordinary conversation about the Halsey situation. Two of Halsey's cowboys had allegedly damaged a fence on the property of a homesteader named Potts, and Luke dealt with it professionally and left. But as he walked back down Pine Street toward his office, he was aware of a sensation in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, something warm and slightly precarious, like a lamp just lit in a cold room. He had been married once. Her name had been Alice, and she had been sweet and cheerful and had died of a fever 3 years ago, in the winter of 1875. He had grieved her deeply and genuinely, and had not looked at another woman since, not because he was making a vow, but because nobody had made him want to look. He had settled into a kind of steady, contained life that suited the work of a deputy in a rough cattle town, purposeful and focused, and not particularly soft. The loneliness was there, but he had organized himself around it, the way you build a house around a load-bearing wall. Mamie Gentry was disturbing the architecture of that arrangement, and he was not sure yet whether to resist it. He found out more about her past not from Edna or Adeline but from Mamie herself, and not because he pressed her, but because on the 6th evening after her arrival, she appeared at his office door at dusk with a plate covered in a cloth. He looked up from his paperwork. She stood in the doorway, straight-backed, holding the plate with both hands. "Edna said you hadn't eaten," she said. "She asked me to bring this over." The second sentence came a beat too fast, the way a justification does when someone isn't entirely sure they need one. He stood up. "That was kind of Edna," he said carefully, giving her the cover she'd provided herself. "And kind of you to bring it." She came inside and set the plate on the corner of his desk. It was roast chicken and corn bread and something that turned out to be stewed peaches, and then stood with her hands folded in front of her in that composed way she had. "You can sit if you like," he said. "I don't have much company in here." She sat in the wooden chair across from his desk. He cleared a space among the papers and began to eat, because she was clearly not going to stay if he treated it as a formal occasion. After a moment, the stiffness in her shoulders eased slightly. "This is good work you do," she said, looking around at the notices on the wall, the maps, the territory survey pinned above the door. "It's necessary work," he said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing." He paused. "Caldwell's been getting larger every season. The trail drives bring money, but they bring trouble with them, and the homesteaders and the ranchers are always at each other's throats over land and water. Somebody's got to be in the middle. You don't mind being in the middle." "Sometimes I mind it plenty," he said honestly. "But I was a rancher's hand for 8 years, and I know both sides of those arguments, and I figure that counts for something." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the town was settling into its evening rhythms. The saloon down the street was warming up, the piano starting, and the occasional sound of boots and spurs on the boards. Caldwell had 2 saloons, a church, a school that was still being built, and the same rotating cast of complications that every cattle town had in 1878. "Why did you leave ranching?" she asked. "My wife passed," he said simply. "I needed to stay in one place for a while, and the deputy position came open." He said it without self-pity, as a plain fact, and she received it that way. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you." He set down his fork. "What about you? What brought you to seamstress work?" A brief tightening around her eyes. "I've always sewn. My mother taught me. We had a farm in Missouri when I was growing up, and sewing was what you did. You made everything yourself, or you did without." She paused. "I was good at it, and when I needed to make my own way, it was the thing I was surest of." He understood the particular weight of the phrase, "when I needed to make my own way." He did not pursue it. Instead, he said, "You're settling in all right. The town treating you well." "Adeline's been wonderful," she said. "People are mostly kind." The mostly was cautious but present. "Is there anyone bothering you?" He asked it directly because he was a lawman and it was his job, but also for other reasons he was becoming less inclined to examine. She met his eyes. "No," she said. "Not yet, not yet." He filed that away. She stood to go, and he walked to the door, and as she stepped out into the warm evening air, he said, without planning to, "Mrs. Gentry." She turned. "If that changes," he said, "you come to me." Something passed across her face, a complex thing, made of relief and sorrow and a long-practiced reluctance to depend on anyone. And then she nodded, once, and walked down Pine Street toward the Caldwell house with her back straight and her steps measured. And Luke stood in his doorway and watched until she was inside. He admitted to himself then, in considerable trouble. The next week passed in a pattern that both of them understood and neither of them named. He stopped at Adeline's shop most mornings, officially about town business, and Mamie would be there working, and they would talk about small things at first, the weather and the price of cloth and the latest piece of news from Wichita, and then gradually larger things, the kind of conversation that happens when two careful people begin to trust each other increment by increment. The way a river cuts a canyon, not all at once but steadily, with great patience and no waste. He learned that she had grown up on a wheat farm in Missouri, the second of 4 children, that her father had been a decent man and her mother a remarkable woman, that she had moved to Abilene in 1874 at the age of 21, following a young man she had believed to be one thing and discovered to be another. She did not name this man directly for some time, but she mentioned a marriage in the way people mention a scar. You see it, you know it's there, and you wait to be told the story of how it happened. He learned that she liked horses more than people in general, but specific people better than most horses. He learned that she had read every novel she could get her hands on, and that her favorites were the ones with complicated women in them. He learned that she had a dry humor that surfaced only when she felt safe, a quick low laugh that he found himself doing almost anything to provoke. She learned things about him too. She learned that he was patient to a degree that occasionally looked like passivity, but was in fact a very deliberate form of strength. She learned that he had a scar on his right forearm from a branding iron accident that he described with more humor than the situation deserved. She learned that he sent money every month to his late wife's mother in Topeka, quietly and without mention to anyone. She learned this from Edna, who learned it from the postmaster, and when Mamie realized what she had learned, she sat for a moment in Adeline's shop and felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding braced for a very long time. It was on a Thursday, 12 days after her arrival, that things changed. Mamie had walked the 3 blocks from the seamstress shop to the general store Hector Vane's, where Luke had been standing that first morning, to purchase thread and buttons, which was a regular errand and entirely unremarkable. She was on her way back, her small parcel under her arm, when she heard a voice she recognized. She recognized it the way you recognize something dangerous, not by thinking but by the animal reaction in the body, the heart going fast and the stomach going cold. It was a voice she had been moving east and then south to get away from for the last 3 weeks. A voice that belonged to a man named Darrell Gentry, who was technically still her husband, who had the legal right in 1878 to consider her his property and to take her back, and who was standing 40 feet away at the hitching post outside the Longhorn Saloon, talking to another man and not yet looking her direction. She walked. She did not run because running would catch the eye, and her whole body was focused on the single task of moving down the street without attracting his attention, of getting to somewhere solid and known before he turned around. She had her eyes on Luke's office, and she moved toward it with everything she had, measuring the distance in heartbeats. She was 20 feet away when she heard him say her name. Mamie. She kept walking. 11 more steps. She counted them. She was at the door of the office, and she pushed it open without knocking, and she went inside, and she had one clear second of relief before she heard the boot steps on the boards behind her. Luke was at his desk. He looked up at her face, and his own face changed, not dramatically, not with alarm, but with a sudden focused stillness, the kind that precedes action. Mamie said, "My husband, he's come." She had not intended to say that word, husband, but there it was between them, and she watched Luke absorb it without flinching. He stood up. He put his hat on. And then Darrell Gentry came through the door of the sheriff's office. Darrell was 35, broad across the shoulders, with a red face and small blue eyes that had always reminded Mamie of something narrow and pressed. He was not a large man in the way that made people afraid of him at first sight. The fear he generated came from familiarity, from the slow accumulation of knowing exactly how far that temper could travel and how fast. He had a smile that he deployed strategically, and he was deploying it now. "There she is," he said, with a warmth that fooled nobody who was paying attention. "Mamie, I've been looking for you 3 weeks, sweetheart." Luke said nothing. He put himself between Mamie and the door, not dramatically, not with his hand on his gun, not with raised voice. He simply stepped into the space between Darrell Gentry and the woman behind him, with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided exactly where he stands and has no intention of moving. Darrell's eyes went to the badge, then to Luke's face, then to the space between them with the calculating look of a man who is accustomed to being able to push through obstacles and is measuring this one. "Howdy," Darrell said, adjusting his tone slightly, adding a layer of reasonable. "Darrell Gentry, that's my wife back there. We had ourselves a misunderstanding and I've come to collect her." "Deputy Luke Dunlap," Luke said. His voice was level and completely without heat, which was somehow more authoritative than anger would have been. "This is the sheriff's office and I'd ask you to state your business." "My business is my wife," Darrell said, and the smile got a fraction thinner. "Mrs. Gentry is here of her own accord and she's a resident of Caldwell in good standing," Luke said. "If you have a legal matter to settle, you can speak with Sheriff Colton. He'll be back from Wichita tomorrow." Behind Luke, Mamie was standing very still, her hands clasped, watching. She was aware of the strange quality of this moment, that no man had ever, in 3 years of marriage to Darrell Gentry, put himself between her and anything. She was aware of Luke's back and the breadth of his shoulders and the absolute, undemonstrative certainty of his posture, and she felt something she had nearly forgotten the name of, which was safety. Darrell looked past Luke at Mamie. "You want to come home, sweetheart," he said, and it was not quite a question. She said no, and her voice did not shake. Darrell was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved. He was calculating, she could tell. There was a deputy between him and her. There was a badge. There was a town around them that would see whatever happened next. He was the kind of man who was brave when the odds were private and grew cautious when they were public. "We'll talk about this," he said, and it was directed at Luke as much as at her, carrying the implication that this was not finished. "Sheriff's office is open 7 days," Luke said pleasantly. Darrell looked at them both, made a decision, and went back out the door. His footsteps crossed the boards and faded, and then there was quiet. Mamie let out a slow breath. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she closed them into fists against her skirt. Luke turned around. He did not say anything immediately. He pulled a chair out from against the wall and set it in the middle of the room, and he looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "Sit down if you'd like." She sat. He sat on the edge of his desk and waited, which was the right thing to do, and she was grateful for it. "The bruise," she said finally, "that you saw when I rode in, that was the last one. I'm calling it the last one because I left 3 days after it happened and I'm not going back." She said it factually, as a declaration of position rather than an invitation for sympathy. "There were others before it. I want to be honest with you about what you're dealing with." "All right," he said. "He's going to stay," she said. "He's not the kind of man who gives up what he considers his. He'll be reasonable and patient for a while, and then he won't be." She was looking at her hands. "I've been through this cycle before. I know how it goes." "You've got legal standing to be here," Luke said. "You've got employment and lodging. Kansas territory law can't compel you to return with him. The sheriff won't force a woman back against her will, not Colton." He paused. "What I want you to know is that I'll be watching, and you should not be alone after dark until we know what he's going to do." She looked up. "I don't want to be a burden on you." "You're not a burden," he said. "You're a person in my town who needs looking after, and that's what I'm here for." He said it with simple conviction, and she believed him, and the particular quality of that belief, uncomplicated and solid, was so different from what she had been living with for 3 years that she had to look away for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. Is there anything else I should know about him? Does he carry? Is he likely to do something public? He carries, yes. He's not reckless when he's sober. When he's been drinking is when things can shift. She pressed her lips together. He drinks most evenings. I'll speak with Tom at the Longhorn and Carl at the Prairie Dog, Luke said. They'll keep me informed. He was efficient about it, and she was grateful for the efficiency too, the way he treated the problem practically rather than making her feel pitied or diminished. She had been through enough situations where the telling of her trouble became another kind of loss, another thing taken from her, her dignity, her privacy, her right to not be an object of someone else's sad fascination. Luke treated it like a logistical problem that required solutions, and she found this so profoundly decent that she had to work to keep her expression steady. Darryl stayed in Caldwell. He took a room at the Prairie Dog Saloon, which had a few cots in the back for travelers of the less respectable variety, and he was seen around town over the following days, at the saloon, at the general store, once outside the livery where he stood and talked to a couple of Halsey's cowboys in a way that made Luke's attention sharpen. He made no direct move toward Mamie. He was playing the waiting game, the patient, reasonable version of himself that she had warned Luke about, and Luke understood that this was its own kind of pressure, the knowledge that he was there, watching, waiting for her to either soften or make a mistake. Luke found himself at Adeline's shop more often during this period, not furtively but openly, and Adeline, who was no fool, watched the two of them with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has identified a good thing in the process of becoming itself. Mamie accepted Luke's presence with a gradual ease that was different from the careful, measured way she had first interacted with him. She began to leave space in conversations for him to fill, to look for him when he arrived, to relax when he was in the room in a way that she couldn't entirely conceal. Luke, for his part, had stopped pretending even to himself that this was only professional concern. He thought about her in the mornings before he was fully awake, when thoughts are honest because the defenses are still down. He thought about the line of her jaw and the way her hands moved when she worked and the quick, surprising laughter. He thought about the bruise that was now healed, yellow-green and fading, and felt something that was not just lawman's anger but something more personal and protective and complicated. He said none of this to her yet. It was not the time. She was still extracting herself from a situation, still finding her footing in a new place, still in the process of rebuilding some sense of her own solidity. He recognized that she needed to feel sure of herself before she could trust anything he might say to her, and he was patient. He was, people always said, unusually patient. It was Adeline who accelerated things, not by interfering but simply by going to visit her sister in Wichita for 3 days, which meant that the shop was quiet, and that Mamie was working alone, which meant that Luke had less pretext for being there but came anyway, knocking at the door mid-morning on the first day, with 2 cups of coffee from the hotel dining room and a manner that was entirely transparent. Mamie opened the door and looked at the coffee cups, and then at him. "Adeline's gone to Wichita," she said. "I know it," he said. A pause. "You came anyway." "I did," he said, and waited. She stepped back and opened the door wider, and he came inside, and they sat at the wide work table with the coffee between them and a length of pale yellow calico waiting to be cut, and the conversation that began there was different from the previous ones. There was less of the careful, incremental nature to it. Something had shifted, the way weather shifts not all at once but in the air pressure before the storm, noticeable to those paying attention. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why do you come?" She said it directly, her dark eyes on him, and he understood she was asking not about the coffee but about the accumulated mornings, the watching, the placing himself between her and trouble. He was quiet for a moment, choosing the words. "Because I want to," he said finally. "That's the simplest answer I have. I'm not going to dress it up." She studied him. "I'm a married woman." "You're a woman who left a man who hurt her and came to a new town to build a new life," he said. Kansas Territory will grant a divorce on grounds of cruelty. I know because I checked with the county judge last week." He said it with a slight self-consciousness that she found endearing. He had looked it up. He had been thinking ahead. He had been practical about something that was anything but ordinary for him. She looked down at the calico. Her hand smoothed a wrinkle in the fabric back and forth, thinking. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I married Daryl when I was 22. I didn't know much then. I know more now, but I'm not sure I know how to do this differently." "You're doing it," he said. "You left, you came here, you're working and you're building something. That's not nothing. That's surviving," she said. "That's not the same as knowing how to," she trailed off. "Trust someone," he offered gently. She met his eyes. "Yes. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once," he said. "I'm just asking you to let me sit here and drink this coffee with you and be honest about why I'm here." Another pause, and then there it was, the quick low laugh, brief and surprised, and his whole chest responded to it. "You're a straightforward man, Mr. Dunlap." "I try to be," he said, "and I think you could probably call me Luke." "Luke," she said, testing it, a small smile. "All right." They drank their coffee and talked for an hour, and the quality of that hour was different from everything that had preceded it, lighter, more alive, with a current running through it that both of them acknowledged by not discussing it, the way you acknowledge something remarkable by sitting very still and breathing carefully so as not to disturb it. Daryl Gentry spent 9 days in Caldwell before he made his next move. Luke had been warned by Tom at the Longhorn that Daryl had been spending his evenings with Halsey's men, and that the conversations had gotten louder and less careful as the whiskey added up. On the 10th day, a Saturday, Luke had been watching the south end of Pine Street because there had been a dispute between two homesteaders over a water source, and he was expecting it to need mediation, when Edna Plum appeared at his side with the particular velocity of a woman who has bad news. "He's at Adeline's shop," she said without preamble. "One of Halsey's boys is with him." Luke was already moving. He came around the corner of Pine Street and saw the situation clearly in one look. Daryl was standing in the doorway of the shop, one hand on the doorframe, and behind him was a man Luke knew as Pete Rourke, one of Halsey's rougher hands. Mamie was visible through the window, standing back from the door, not retreating to the back room but not coming forward either, holding her ground on her own territory. Luke crossed the street without hurrying his pace, because hurrying communicated urgency, and urgency gave Daryl information about how worried Luke was. He came up the steps of Adeline's porch with the measured step of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and has all the time in the world. "Daryl," he said, making it a greeting. Daryl turned, and his face went through several expressions quickly: surprise, calculation, the performance of innocence. "Deputy, just visiting my wife." "Looks like she's working," Luke said. He glanced at Pete Rourke. "Pete, Halsey send you into town?" Pete shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a man trying to be invisible. "Just came in for supplies." "The general store's 2 blocks north," Luke said, and waited. The waiting was the thing. He had learned this, that in these situations the man who speaks less and holds his position longer usually wins, and he held it now with his hands loose at his sides and his expression completely neutral. Pete Rourke looked at Daryl. Some private communication passed between them, and then Pete made a decision and stepped off the porch. Daryl turned back to the doorway. "Mamie," he said. "Come on out here and talk to me." "I don't have anything to say to you, Daryl," she said, and her voice was even. "You're still my wife." "Not for much longer," she said, and this was the first time she had said it out loud, and it clearly landed on Daryl like a slap. His jaw tightened. His hand on the doorframe tightened too. Luke stepped up beside Daryl and said quietly, so only the three of them could hear it, "The sheriff's back from Wichita. If you cause a disturbance on this street today, you'll be spending tonight in a cell. And you'll be talking to Judge Fletcher on Monday about why you rode 200 miles to follow a woman who has told you she's done. That's not going to help your case any." Daryl stared at Luke with the look of a man who is furious and calculating at the same time. Then he stepped back from the door. "This isn't finished," he said. "Sheriff's office is open 7 days," Luke said again, And this time there was something in his tone that was quieter and more personal and more final than the first time he'd said it. Darryl left. Luke stood on the porch until he was a block away, and then he turned to the doorway where Mamie was standing. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright with something, not tears, but the emotion that lives on the same territory as tears, the overwhelming quality of being seen and defended. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. He followed her inside, and she closed the door behind them. She stood with her back to it and pressed her hands against the wood and breathed. He waited, watching her, and after a moment she looked up at him. "He won't stop," she said. "Not until something stops him." "I know it," Luke said. "I'm going to speak with Judge Fletcher this afternoon about the divorce proceedings. You'll need to make a statement, written and sworn. It won't be easy." "I'll do it," she said immediately. "Whatever it takes." "Good." He paused. "Mamie, are you all right?" It was a simple question, and she received it with a complexity that moved across her face like weather, the bracing against the habit of saying fine, the careful testing of whether she could tell the truth, the arrival at a decision. "I'm frightened," she said. "I want to not be, but I am." "That's honest," he said, "and you have every reason. But I'm going to do my job, and the law is on your side, and you are not alone in this. I want you to know that plainly." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had been wary when she first arrived and were now something different, softer, more open, seeing him in a way that made his breath come with slightly more effort. "I know it," she said softly. "I see it." They stood in the afternoon light of the seamstress shop with the calico and the dress form and the quiet industry of the place around them, and something settled between them. Not the romantic thing yet, not with Darryl still in town and her situation still unresolved, but something foundational, something that said this is real and we both know it and it is worth protecting. He went to Judge Fletcher that afternoon. The judge was a compact, precise man who had seen a great deal in 20 years on the Kansas circuit and maintained his idealism about the law with a commitment that Luke had always respected. He listened to Luke's account and asked careful questions, and at the end he said, "She'll need to file a petition. She'll need to appear before me and give testimony. If her account of physical cruelty is credible and documented, which from what you're telling me it is, I can grant the decree within 30 days, possibly less." "What about him?" Luke said. "What's his recourse?" "He can contest it," Fletcher said. "But contesting it means he stays in Caldwell and makes his case, and if he's the kind of man you're describing, staying in Caldwell and making a legal case is not his preferred mode." He folded his hands on his desk. "Men like that prefer to operate outside the courts, Dunlap. That's where you come in." Luke understood. He went back to Mamie that evening and explained the process, and she listened with the focused attention of someone memorizing a map, committing the legal pathways to her mind with the same precision she applied to a difficult seam. 30 days, she said. "Maybe less." She nodded slowly. "And what does he do in those 30 days?" "I'll be watching," Luke said. "I've spoken with Sheriff Colton. He's aware of the situation. You won't be unprotected." She was quiet, thinking, and then she said, "What did he say?" "Colton." Luke allowed himself a small smile. "He said, and I quote, that any man who follows a woman across 200 miles because she left him is either a man in love or a man who can't stand being defied, and he'd lay odds on the second." Mamie made a short sound that was almost a laugh. "Colton's a perceptive man. He has his moments." She filed the petition the following Monday morning in the Sumner County Courthouse, which was a brick building of modest ambition on the main street of Wellington, 20 miles north. Luke drove her in the sheriff's buggy. Colton insisted on the buggy, on the grounds that it was official transport, and sat in the waiting area while Mamie spoke with Judge Fletcher's clerk. She came out an hour later with ink-stained fingers and a look of such concentrated resolution that it hurt something in Luke to see it. The way courage is always painful to witness in its pure form. On the way back to Caldwell, they talked about things that had nothing to do with Darryl or divorce or legal proceedings. She asked about the landscape, the great rolling flatness of the Kansas grassland, which she had not grown up with, the way it went on and on under the enormous sky. He told her about the first time he had seen it, coming west from Ohio at 17 with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a letter of introduction to a rancher near Dodge City who turned out to be as rough as the country he ran cattle on. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," he said. "Didn't show it, which was the thing that saved me, I think. The rancher liked that I didn't flinch." "Is that where you learned it, the not flinching?" He considered this. The buggy moved through the dry grass and the sky was enormous overhead, the kind of blue that has no ceiling, and he thought about the question honestly rather than giving her the easy answer. "My father first," he said. He wasn't a demonstrative man, but he was steady. You always knew where you stood with him. I think I learned from him that steady is more useful than loud. He paused. "Why?" "Because you do it," she said. "You're steady in a way that I haven't encountered very often. It makes it easier to—" She stopped. "To what?" he asked, genuinely curious. "To breathe," she said, and then looked out at the grassland as if she hadn't intended to say something so direct. And he looked at the road ahead and felt something expand in his chest that was not quite pain and not quite joy, but occupied the territory between them. Darrell Gentry made his final move on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Mamie's arrival in Caldwell. Luke found out later from Tom at the Longhorn that Darrell had been drinking steadily that afternoon, that he had made several remarks about what he planned to do that the barkeep had not taken fully seriously, until they were followed by Darrell leaving with purposeful strides toward the north end of Pine Street. Tom sent his boy running for Luke, which was the right thing to do, but Darrell had a 3-minute head start. Mamie was alone in Adeline's shop. Adeline had gone to the women's prayer meeting at the new church, when the front door came open with a force that was not a knock. Darrell came in with the liquid confidence of a man who has given himself permission to do something he knows is wrong by drinking enough to stop caring. "Get your things," he said. Mamie stood up from the sewing table. She did not reach for anything, did not look at the window, did not show him fear because she had learned years ago that fear was fuel for him. "No," she said. "This is finished, Mamie. You're coming home." "My home is here now," she said. "I've filed for divorce, Darrell. It's in the county record. Go talk to a lawyer." He crossed the room in 3 steps and took hold of her arm. The back door of the shop, which led to Adeline's house, opened and Luke came through it. He had gone around the back of the building when he saw which direction Darrell was heading, moving fast on the parallel alley, and he had come through the connecting door that Adeline kept unlocked. Darrell turned, still holding Mamie's arm. Luke stood in the doorway between the back room and the shop. His hand was at his belt. His face was the face of a man who is furious but is not going to let that fury make his decisions. He said, "Let go of her arm, Darrell." The quality of his voice in that moment was something Mamie would remember for the rest of her life. It was quiet and it was absolute, and it contained no negotiation whatsoever. Darrell let go. His chin went up with the defensive anger of a man who has been caught. "You've got no right to involve yourself in a man's family business. You're in a woman's place of business, and you've laid hands on her against her will," Luke said, coming into the room. "That's my business. Step outside." He had Darrell out the door and off the porch before Darrell had quite worked out how it had happened, and the conversation that followed on the street was brief and extremely clear. Darrell was not arrested that day, because Luke judged it better strategy to let the legal process complete rather than create a situation that might complicate the divorce proceedings. But Darrell was walked to the edge of Caldwell with a direct communication from Sheriff Colton, who had arrived at a run after Tom's boy found him, that if he returned before the divorce was finalized, he would be held on charges of harassment and interference with civil court proceedings. Darrell rode out of Caldwell on a Friday morning, before anyone was fully awake, which was what Mamie had predicted, that he would go quietly when the public scrutiny became too strong, because his real power had always been in private. Mamie stood at the window of Adeline's shop that Friday morning and watched the empty road east and breathed in and breathed out, and Adeline put a cup of tea on the table beside her without a word, and the morning light came through the shop window and lay in long golden strips across the work table. Luke came by mid-morning. He knocked, which he always did, and came in, and he stood in the middle of the shop with his hat in his hands and looked at Mamie with a directness that no longer had any pretense in it. "He's gone," he said. "I know," she said, a pause. "You all right?" he asked. She considered the question in the way she was beginning to allow herself fully and honestly, without the reflex to compress the answer into something easy. "Better than all right," she said finally, "which is something I wasn't sure I'd be able to say for a long time." He nodded slowly. His hat was turning in his hands, which was the only indication that he was nervous, and she found this deeply endearing, the nervous hat turning of a steady man who had run a dangerous man out of town with his voice and was now uncertain how to say what he wanted to say. "Mamie," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I need to tell you something, and I want to say it plain. Not right now, maybe, because you've just had a difficult morning and the divorce isn't final yet, and I'm aware of that. But I want you to know that what I feel for you is not an extension of what I do for my job. I'm not standing between you and trouble because it's my duty. I do my duty for other reasons, and for you I'm standing there for a different reason entirely, and I think you know what that reason is, but I want to say it plain because you deserve things said plain." She was very still. "I care for you," he said, "a considerable amount, and I would like the chance to show you that when you're ready and when things are settled." The morning light lay between them across the floor, and outside a rooster crowed 2 streets over, and someone's dog was barking at something, and Caldwell went on being Caldwell with all its noise and ordinary motion. And in the middle of it, Mamie Gentry looked at Luke Dunlap and felt something in her that had been dormant for so long she had almost stopped believing it existed. It was not the desperate hoping she had felt at 22, the way she had felt about Darryl in the beginning before she knew who he was. This was quieter and more certain, the way the Kansas grassland was quiet and certain solid all the way down as far as you could dig. "I know what that reason is," she said. "And I would like that chance too." He smiled then, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, and she thought she could probably make a study of Luke Dunlap's smile and not exhaust the subject. "Good," he said, with a simplicity that made her laugh. The 30 days that followed were the best 30 days Mamie could remember in years, which she was aware said something complicated about those years but tried not to dwell on. She was building something, she reminded herself. She was in the present tense. Luke courted her with the same steady deliberateness that characterized everything he did, and she found his courtship entirely unlike anything she had experienced with Darryl, who had courted her with a dramatic intensity that she had mistaken for depth. Luke's version of courtship was quiet and attentive, and consisted primarily of being present, of arriving with coffee and staying to talk, of walking her back to the Caldwell house on evenings when the light was good and the street was quiet, of finding reasons to make her laugh and paying close attention to what she said. He took her riding one Sunday, which was the day they both had free, out on the eastern prairie where the grassland rolled away in every direction, and the sky was the whole world. She rode the bay mare, and he rode a rangy sorrel gelding that he called Red with a lack of creativity she teased him about, and they rode for 2 hours along the creek bottom, where the cottonwoods were turning gold in the September air. And it was on this ride that she told him the rest of the story about Darryl. Not the abbreviated version she had given him before, but the fuller account. The early years when she had believed his temper was something she could manage, the slow erosion of herself. The last 3 years that had been the worst, the final incident that had left the bruise that he had seen when she rode in. He listened without interrupting, which was the right way to receive it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm glad you left." "So am I," she said. "It took me longer than it should have." "It takes as long as it takes," he said. "That's not a judgment, Mamie, that's just a fact." She looked at him sideways in the golden afternoon light, on horseback on the Kansas prairie with the cottonwoods turning and the creek running shallow over the stones, and she thought that she had been given something unexpected and rare, and she intended to hold it carefully. He reached over from his horse and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her, really touched her, deliberately, not the brief grip of a handshake. And his hand was warm and calloused and entirely sure, and she held it back. They rode like that for a while along the creek, hand in hand between the horses, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything necessary to say. The divorce was granted in early October of 1878 by Judge Fletcher, who noted in his decree that the grounds of physical cruelty were amply established by Mrs. Gentry's testimony, and the corroborating accounts of 2 witnesses in Harlow Creek who had been reluctant to speak, but had done so when assured of the court's protection. Darrell Gentry did not contest it. The clerk in Wellington sent the papers to Adeline's shop, where Mamie was working on a wedding dress for the daughter of the town's new schoolmaster, and she held the documents in her hands for a long time before folding them carefully and putting them in the cedar box she kept under her cot at the Caldwell house. She told Luke that evening. He had brought supper roast chicken. In a kind of private callback to the evening she had brought him chicken at his office, which she recognized immediately, and which made her love him more for the attention it implied. It came, she said, when she opened the door of the hotel dining room where they had started taking most of their suppers together. He looked at her face and understood. "How do you feel?" he asked. She sat down and unfolded her napkin and thought about it. "Free," she said, "and a little frightened of free because I haven't been it for a long time and I'm not entirely sure what to do with it." "You do with it whatever you want," he said. "That's what free means." She looked across the table at him. The oil lamp was between them and the dining room was half full with the usual evening crowd, cowboys from the trail and homesteaders, and a table of women from the Ladies' Temperance Society who were conspicuously not looking at Luke and Mamie and were therefore clearly looking at them very attentively. Mamie found that she didn't mind. "I want to stay in Caldwell," she said. "I want to keep working with Adeline. I want to save enough to have my own shop someday, when Adeline decides she's ready to stop." "That's good," he said. "And I want—" She paused, finding the words, and the room was suddenly very quiet to her despite all its noise. "I want to know where this is going, Luke." "What you want, I need to hear it said." He set down his fork. He looked at her directly as he always did, with those gray eyes that she had first found unreadable and now found to be among the most readable things she had ever encountered. "I want to marry you," he said. "When you're ready. Not before, and I'm not putting a timetable on ready. But I want you to know that's the direction I'm going so you know where I'm standing." She breathed. Outside the window, Caldwell went on cattle lowing somewhere at the edge of town. A burst of piano music from the Longhorn. The dry wind off the prairie carrying the smell of grass and dust that was already becoming the smell of home. "I'll need some time," she said. "Not a long time, but some." "I know it," he said. "Take what you need." She took 3 months, which was not very long by any standard and was exactly right by hers. It was December before she said yes, a cold, clear evening with the first hard frost of the season on the ground and a sky full of stars that had the particular hard brightness of winter stars over the Kansas plains. They were standing on the porch of the Caldwell house, which she was still living in, and he had walked her back from Adeline's Christmas sewing party, which Adeline held every year and which had included half the women in Caldwell and a great deal of apple cider and laughter. He had not asked her again. He was not the kind of man who asked twice, having been clear the first time, and she had known all along that the question was standing there patiently between them, waiting for her to be ready. She turned on the porch and he was beside her and the stars were overhead and she said, "Luke." He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." He was still for a moment. That complete stillness she had learned meant he was feeling something strongly and was deciding how to hold it. Then he took her face in his hands gently, with a carefulness that was the opposite of everything she had been afraid to allow, and kissed her for the first time. And the warmth of it against the cold night air was everything she had not let herself imagine, and everything she had let herself hope. They were married in February of 1879, in the new church on the east end of Caldwell, which had been completed enough by winter to hold services, and which smelled of new wood and cold air. The town turned out with the enthusiasm that a frontier community always reserves for a good wedding, which represents the kind of hope that the hard life of the territory regularly threatens and regularly needs. Adeline made the dress, which was cream-colored wool with pale blue trim, because Mamie refused to be impractical about Kansas winters, and it was the finest garment Adeline said she had ever produced, which was saying something. Luke stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had ordered from Kansas City, and when Mamie came through the door on Edna Plum's arm, Edna having volunteered for the role with a firmness that brooked no discussion. He had the expression of a man who has had most of his luck used up in getting somewhere, and is standing in that somewhere with the full awareness of how good it is. Sheriff Colton, who stood up with Luke, said afterward that he had never seen Luke smile that much in 2 years of working with him, and it was disorienting. They had supper at the hotel. Edna had organized it as a wedding dinner with the help of half the Ladies' Temperance Society, who turned out to have views about temperance that relaxed considerably when applied to wedding celebrations, and danced in the cleared hotel dining room to the fiddle and harmonica of 2 cowboys who turned out to be more musically gifted than their occupations suggested. Mamie danced with Luke and with Adeline, and with the schoolmaster's wife, and with Sheriff Colton, who danced like a man who had once known how, and was now reassembling the memory in real time. Luke and Mamie moved into his house, which was a modest but solid 2-room structure on the west side of town that he had built with a rancher's practicality and a bachelor's unfortunate indifference to comfort. Mamie addressed the comfort issue with efficiency and a few months' savings, and by the following spring the house had curtains at the windows and a rug from a trader in Wellington, and a vegetable garden behind it that became her particular pride, the Kansas soil being more generous than she had initially expected. She kept working with Adeline. She had, by this point, taken on nearly all of the shop's output, with Adeline's hands beginning to give her the trouble that age brings to a seamstress, and the arrangement suited them both perfectly. Mamie's skill and capacity, Adeline's name and connections, and the quiet joy she took in mentoring a woman she had recognized from the first as extraordinary. Luke was made full sheriff in the spring of 1879, when old Colton announced his retirement, with the satisfaction of a man who has held on long enough to hand things to someone he trusts. The town council voted unanimously, which Luke accepted with the same steady lack of drama that he applied to everything else, and Mamie stood in the back of the council room and felt proud in a way that was entirely new to her, the pride that comes from someone you love being recognized for who they actually are. The summer of 1879 was a good one. The cattle drives came through as they always did, and Luke managed the seasonal chaos with his characteristic efficiency, and Mamie's shop. She and Adeline had agreed to put both names above the door, Farrow and Dunlap seamstresses, which Adeline insisted on because she said it was only right, was busy enough that she was turning down some work. She received a letter in July from her mother in Missouri, the first communication from her family in over a year. The family knew something of what had happened with Darrell, though not everything, and the letter was cautious and warm by turns, her mother's handwriting covering 3 pages with the news of the farm, and the careful questions of a woman who wants to know that her daughter is all right, but doesn't want to press too hard on what might still be tender. Mamie sat at the kitchen table and read it twice and then wrote back immediately, 4 pages, telling her mother about Caldwell and the shop and Luke, and the telling of it made her see it all freshly, the way description forces clarity, the good solid life she had built, the man she had found, the way the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay on the floorboards she had scrubbed clean. and she was overcome for a moment by an emotion that she identified after some consideration as plain and uncomplicated happiness. She told Luke about the letter that evening. "Are you going to see them?" he asked. "Maybe next year," she said. "When the shop is in a good place and you can get away for a week." "I can get away," he said, "any time you want to go." "Maybe we take them something," she said. "Something from Kansas." "Like what?" she thought. "Grass seeds," she said, and laughed at herself because there was nothing romantic about it, but the image was real, sending her mother a packet of Kansas bluestem grass seed to grow along the fence of the Missouri farm, a small piece of the prairie that had become home. He smiled at her. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the evening air cooling toward September, and the sky was doing the thing it did in Kansas that she had come to love, going through colors as the sun went down that a painter might not believe, the reds and golds, and finally a deep blue that had the quality of something that had been thought about very carefully before being installed. In the fall of 1879, Mamie discovered she was pregnant. She was in the back room of the shop when she understood what the evidence was telling her, and she sat down on Adeline's old three-legged stool and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Adeline, who had been in the front room sorting thread, came to the doorway and looked at her with the perception of a woman who has seen this face before on other women. "Adeline," Mamie said. "I know," Adeline said. "I'm frightened," Mamie said, because she was, and it would have been absurd to pretend otherwise. The fear was different from the old fear. It had nothing to do with Darryl, nothing to do with what could be taken from her. It was the fear that accompanies the prospect of something precious, the way you hold a good cup carefully because the good cup can break. "Of course you are," Adeline said. "Every sensible woman is. Sit there a minute and then go home and tell your husband." She told Luke that evening after supper in the kitchen where the lamp was on the table between them and the house around them was warm and solid. She said it directly, the way she had learned to say things to him, because he always received directness with the respect it deserved. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "In the spring, I think." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her. His face did the thing it did when he was feeling something strongly, the particular quality of stillness, and then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so," she said. "I'm frightened." "I know," he said. "Me too." "You are?" "Of course I am," he said with a slight smile. "I've never done this before either." The admission was so simple and so honest that she felt the fear ease by a degree that she would not have predicted. She squeezed his hand. He held it. "We'll do it together," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." He was careful with her through the winter, in a way that was attentive without being suffocating, this distinction being one she was grateful for, having experienced the suffocating version and knowing precisely the difference. He came home for his midday meal when he could, and he took over the heavier domestic tasks with an unobtrusiveness that she noted and appreciated. And he read to her in the evenings from the novels she ordered through the general store, because she said reading made her back ache, but she couldn't stop thinking about the books. So he read to her while she sewed the small garments that began accumulating in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed. He was, she thought, on a February evening with the snow falling outside, and his voice reading Scott to her while she worked on a small white blanket, the most unexpectedly tender man she had ever encountered, and she was grateful every day that she had ridden into Caldwell with a bruise on her jaw and been met by his steady gray eyes and his deliberate, unhurried decency. She told him this one evening, not because she had planned to, but because she was thinking it, and it seemed wasteful not to say it. He looked up from the book. "What?" "I'm grateful," she said. "For you, I don't say it enough." He set the book down. "You don't need to say it," he said. "I want to," she said. "I need you to know that I see you, what you are. I need you to know it isn't something I take for granted." He was quiet for a moment, receiving this. "I need you to know the same," he said finally, "that you changed something for me that I thought was fixed. I had organized myself around being alone, and I had told myself it was fine, and then you came into my town and it turned out it wasn't fine at all. It was just what I'd gotten used to." He paused. You make everything better, Mamie. Just by being in it. The snow fell outside and the lamp was warm between them, and she put down the blanket she was working on and crossed the room to him, and he put his arms around her without getting up from the chair, holding her carefully and completely. And they stayed like that while the snow accumulated on the porch railing, and the house creaked in the prairie wind, and everything outside was cold, and everything inside was not. William James Dunlap was born in April of 1880, on a morning when the first wildflowers were coming up on the prairie, and the cottonwoods were putting out their new leaves, and he came into the world with the emphatic voice of a person who has opinions and intends to make them known. He was a solid, healthy boy with Luke's coloring and Mamie's dark eyes, and when Luke held him in the upstairs room of their house with the morning light coming through the curtains, his face had the expression of a man who has been rearranged at the molecular level by something he could not have prepared for. Adeline, who had been at the birth along with the doctor and Edna, declared him perfect with the authority of a woman who has earned the right to that kind of pronouncement. Edna cried, which surprised everyone except Edna herself. Mamie held her son and looked at Luke and thought about the morning she had ridden into Caldwell with the east sky bruised purple, and a fear she had been carrying so long she had stopped being able to feel its weight. She thought about Luke stepping between her and the door of his office without a word, just placing himself there with that absolute certainty, and she thought about everything that had followed the careful incremental trust, the coffee and the conversations, the riding along the creek with their hands joined between the horses, the marriage in the cold church with Adeline's curtains blowing in the prairie wind. She had built something. She had started over and she had built something real. "Hello, William," she said softly to the baby in her arms. "This is your home." The years that followed were full ones, busy and good. William grew quickly and loudly, as healthy children do, and from the earliest age he had his father's observant quality, the watchfulness, the taking in of things before acting on them. He followed Luke around the house and eventually around the town, with the devoted shadow quality of a small boy who has identified the most interesting person in his world and intends to remain close to them at all times. Adeline retired in the spring of 1882, when her hands finally told her they had done what they could, and she was ready to spend her mornings at leisure, which for her meant helping with the church and organizing the Ladies' Aid Society and reading extensively, and she handed the shop over to Mamie with a ceremony that was mostly practical. The inventory, the client accounts, the supplier contacts, but that was also, in the privacy of the moment, deeply emotional. The sign above the door was changed to Dunlap Seamstresses, which Mamie had argued against on the grounds that it erased Adeline's name, and Adeline had argued for it on the grounds that Mamie had earned her name above her own door, and that was an end of it. Mamie hired a girl named Clara, the 20-year-old daughter of one of the homesteaders outside town who had a gift for the work and needed the income, and together they expanded the shop's offerings into dressmaking that served not just Caldwell, but the surrounding settlements, orders coming in by mail from women as far away as Kiowa and Harper, who had heard through the women's networks of the territory about the quality of work coming out of Caldwell. Luke was sheriff through the early 1880s, managing the ongoing transition of Caldwell from a rough cattle town to something that was trying, with considerable effort and partial success, to become a proper community. The cattle drives were diminishing as the range was fenced and the railroad changed the routes, and the town was evolving accordingly: more homesteaders, more families, the school finally completed, and a second church under construction. There were hard times. A drought in the summer of 1881 made the homesteaders desperate and created tensions that Luke worked through with his characteristic combination of patience and firmness. A dispute between two of the larger ranches over water rights in 1882 required weeks of careful mediation that left him tired and drawn for the better part of a month. There was a fire on Pine Street in the fall of 1882 that destroyed the livery and 2 neighboring buildings before the town's bucket brigade stopped it. And Luke came home from that covered in ash and smelling of smoke, and Mamie met him at the door and held him for a long time without asking anything. She received a letter from her youngest sister in Missouri in the summer of 1882, telling her that their mother had been ill but had recovered. And on the strength of that letter and the recovered health that it announced, Mamie and Luke finally made the trip to Missouri that had been planned and postponed for 3 years. They went in September, when the cattle drives were done, and the shop could be left in Clara's capable hands for 2 weeks. Luke asked one of the newly appointed deputy marshals to cover Caldwell, which Colton, now retired and living contentedly at the edge of town with a vegetable garden that competed with Mamie's, declared entirely adequate supervision. They took William, who was 2.5 and had the energy of a small locomotive and the adaptability of a child who has been raised around a busy household and an occupied, interested pair of parents. The Missouri farm was smaller than Mamie had remembered, or perhaps Kansas had recalibrated her sense of scale. Her mother came out of the farmhouse door and walked down the path toward the wagon with the careful, emotion-compressed gait of a woman who has been waiting a long time and is not going to run. And then Mamie climbed down from the wagon and they held each other on the dirt path between the gate and the door. And that was enough, more than enough. Her mother liked Luke immediately, and with a directness that he found both touching and slightly alarming. She cornered him at the kitchen table on the first evening with a directness that Mamie recognized as entirely hereditary. "You take care of my girl," her mother said. "Yes, ma'am," Luke said. "She's had enough of the other kind." "I know it, ma'am," he said. "She takes care of me, too." Her mother looked at him for a long moment with the assessment of a woman who has earned the right to such assessments, and then nodded once, and that was the end of it. They stayed 12 days, and Mamie walked every morning through the farm she had grown up on, the familiar geography of it, the creek at the eastern boundary and the tree where she had read all summer as a girl, and the smell of the Missouri earth that was darker and richer than Kansas. She was not the girl who had left this place. She was someone who had been made and unmade and remade, and the remade version was more fully herself than the original, which is perhaps the only good thing that can be said about the unmade part. Luke walked beside her on these mornings, easy in the Missouri countryside the way he was easy everywhere, and William tottered between them, grabbing at everything interesting, which was everything. On the last morning, Mamie stood at the gate and looked back at the farmhouse and felt the particular combination of love and freedom that comes from knowing a place well enough to leave it, knowing it will hold. They went home to Caldwell. In the spring of 1883, Mamie found herself pregnant again, which she received with less fear this time and more of a warm, settled anticipation, as though her body and her life had arrived at an understanding. The second baby came in November, a boy again, which Luke received with delight, and William received with the existential alarm of a child who is about to be dislodged from his position as the center of the universe. They named him Thomas after Luke's father, and he was dark-haired like Mamie and loud like both of them. And within 6 months, William had made his peace with the situation and could be found showing Thomas things with the important seriousness of an older brother who has a great deal to impart. Clara in the shop had by this point become essential not just as an employee but as a friend, someone Mamie trusted with the work and with the accounts and gradually with the more important things. Clara had a young man she was considering, a quiet homesteader's son from north of town named Henry Birch, and she asked Mamie's opinion in the careful way that young women ask older women whom they respect, and Mamie gave her opinion honestly, which was that Henry Birch seemed like a man who meant what he said and said what he meant, and that this was, in her experience, the most important thing. Clara married Henry in the spring of 1884, in the same church where Mamie and Luke had married, and the dress was made in the shop on Pine Street, and Mamie made it herself because some things you do yourself regardless of how busy you are. Adeline Farrow died peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1885, at 73, in her house with the shop attached that had by then been the source of so much practical beauty for so many women in the territory. Mamie grieved her with the real grief of someone who has lost a genuine benefactor and friend, and stood at the grave on the cold December day with Luke's hand in hers, and thought about the grace of people who open doors for you when you arrive with nothing but your best skill and your determination, and a bruise on your face. She put Adeline's name back on the sign. Farrow and Dunlap seamstresses, it said, because it had always seemed like the right way to put it, and Adeline was past being able to argue about it. The town of Caldwell went on growing and changing. The big cattle drives were largely over by the mid-1880s, the era of the open range closing as the barbed wire went up and the homesteaders claimed the land, and the town adapted with the practicality of places that want to survive. There was more farming now, more family businesses, more women shaping the character of the place. The school had 2 teachers. There was a doctor. The Ladies' Aid Society, which Adeline had been instrumental in founding, was doing serious work around education and welfare that Mamie had joined and eventually helped to lead. Luke navigated the changing character of the territory with his usual steadiness, his role shifting gradually from the active management of frontier danger to the more administrative demands of a growing town with proper law county courts, territorial governance, the increasing machinery of civilization pressing in around the old wilderness. He was good at it. He had always been good at the middle. On an evening in the fall of 1886, 8 years after Mamie had ridden into Caldwell on the bay mare with the carpetbag and the bruise on her jaw, she sat on the porch of the house on the west side of town, a larger house now, expanded twice over the years, with a good kitchen and 3 bedrooms and the vegetable garden that had spread and improved with each season, and watched the sky go through its colors over the Kansas grassland. William was 7 and had his father's watchfulness and his mother's quick humor, and spent his days at the school and his evenings doing his lessons at the kitchen table with the determined efficiency of a child who has been shown that effort produces results. Thomas was 3 and still largely chaotic, a small force of nature who ran everywhere he went and had recently discovered that questions, asked in sufficient quantity, had the power to immobilize adults. Luke came out onto the porch and sat beside her in the other chair, and they watched the sky together the way they had learned to watch everything together, attentively, without commentary, letting it be what it was. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the morning I rode in." She paused. "About what I must have looked like." "You looked like a woman who knew what she was doing and was going to do it regardless of what it cost her," he said. Turned her head to look at him. "That's generous." "That's accurate," he said. She smiled. Below them in the house, Thomas was conducting some kind of inquiry that involved several loud questions directed at no one in particular, and William's patient older brother voice rose and fell in response. The evening star was out over the prairie, the first one, bright and definite above the darkening grass. "I wrote to Judge Fletcher last week," she said. "About the school. They need a new roof before winter." "I know, I told the county council. What did they say?" "They said they'd allocate funds in the spring." "That's too late," she said. "I know it," he said. "I'm working on it." "I'll raise money through the Aid Society," she said. "We can have it done in 3 weeks if we start now." He looked at her with the smile she had spent 8 years studying and had not yet finished with. "Of course you will," he said. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it that first time on horseback along the creek, and held it in the evening cool with the prairie grass moving in the last of the light. "Luke," she said. "Yes." She had been going to say something about the roof fund or the Aid Society or the winter preparations, but what came out instead was, "I'm happy." He was quiet for a moment, holding her hand in the dark that was coming, the first stars multiplying over the grassland. "So am I," he said. They sat there as the evening came fully down and the children's voices floated up from inside the house, William's patient and Thomas's insistent, and the ordinary music of a household that is full and warm and ongoing. The prairie wind moved through the grass, and the stars came out in their hundreds, and the town of Caldwell settled into its evening sounds, quieter now than in the cattle days, more domestic, the sound of a place that had made its peace with being a real place rather than an outpost on the edge of something. She had come into this town with nothing she wanted to keep and everything she wanted to build. She had found, in the unexpected geography of the Kansas prairie, the life that had been waiting for her somewhere beyond the one she had been living. She had found a man whose steadiness was not coldness but the opposite of coldness, whose patience was not distance but the most attentive kind of presence, who had put himself between her and trouble not because it was his job but because she mattered to him, and he was not the kind of man to stand at a remove from what mattered. The bruise had healed and the fear had healed, and the long, cautious business of learning to trust had resolved into something that was simply daily life. The two of them in the house that they had made together, the children that had come from that, the work they both did and were proud of, the evenings on the porch with the Kansas sky doing its enormous and beautiful work overhead. In the spring of 1887, the school got its new roof, paid for partly by the county and partly by the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society roof fund that Mamie had organized in 3 weeks exactly as she had said she would. The schoolmaster, a young man from Ohio who was still finding his footing in the territory, shook her hand on the steps of the school and said he didn't know how she had managed it. "You ask directly," she said. "You tell people what's needed and what it will do. People generally want to help if you give them the chance to." He nodded, filing this away. She walked back down Pine Street in the late spring morning, past the shop with its sign in Adeline's memory, past the hotel where she had spent her first months in Caldwell, past the sheriff's office where Luke's voice could be heard through the window, conducting an unhurried conversation with one of his deputies. She stopped at the office door the way she had stopped there the very first time and looked in. He was at his desk. He looked up and saw her, and the smile came, and she thought, as she had thought many times over the years, that she would never stop being glad that she had found it, this place, this life, this particular steady man with the gray eyes and the hat he turned in his hands when he was nervous. "Coffee," she said. "Please," he said. She went in. Outside, Caldwell went on in the morning light, busy and ordinary and alive, full of the ongoing ordinary work of people trying to build something decent in a hard and beautiful country. And in the sheriff's office on Pine Street, Mamie Dunlap poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and sat across the desk from her husband, and they talked, as they always did, about everything that mattered and a great deal that didn't, and the day went on around them. And everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and it was good.